Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Today, folks, we are going to talk about one of the hottest new American cars on the market today. Yes, we are talking about the C8 Corvette. And let me tell you all, this is not your grandpa's garage queen Corvette. This mid-engine monster is the very first Vette of its kind. What we have for you today, the lowdown on the new C8. For all of you out there who are not familiar with Corvette nomenclature, that means that this is the 8th generation. We will also talk about the competition, or lack thereof, the Corvette's long and storied past, and stay tuned for my personal take on the new C8 Corvette, with also my top 5 favorite Corvette-esque automobiles from the past and the present. Now, many may wonder, why on earth is the new Corvette such a big deal? I have 2 words. Mid-engine. That's right. The new Corvette has finally made the transition from a front-engine rear-wheel drive platform to a mid-engine rear-wheel drive platform, a setup used by most of today's ultra-high-performance cars. This puts the Vette in a unique position in the American automotive landscape. Now, think about that for a second, folks. GM has not offered a mid-engine sports car that's affordable since the demise of, I believe, the Pontiac Fiero in 1988, which was effectively known as the poor man's Ferrari. I mean, let's be serious. Fiero, Ferrari, the names are too similar. That totally wasn't a coincidence. So many people don't actually realize that. That was 32 years ago. Nearly 1/3 of a century. The only other mid-engine American sports car offered by the Big Three, and by that I mean Chrysler, GM, and Ford, is the Ford GT, which is a limited production supercar that many considered to be a homegrown exotic. The Ford GT was originally a race car designed by Ford to beat Ferrari at Le Mans back in the 1960s, I believe. Ford literally wrote a blank check, told his engineers, beat Ferrari, and that's exactly what they did. So about 50 years later, for Ford's 100th anniversary in 2005, Ford came out with a new version of the GT that was supposed to be a road-going version, and I believe in 2016 they came out with the 2nd generation of the new GT. And that's the only other mid-engined American car that I can actually think of. Yeah, Chrysler doesn't have any offerings. Of course, Chrysler these days has now been kind of floundering, especially since they discontinued the Dodge Viper, and now they are focusing mainly on their Challenger and their Charger with the Hellcat engines, and even the Demon engine that has 808 horsepower or something ridiculous like that. But as far as mid-engine sports cars, nah. I mean, in that price range, GM with their new C8 Corvette is the only one that offers such a thing. So this means that the Corvette is tapping into a market space that has largely been void. I mean, the mid-engine American sports car. When you think of mid-engine American sports cars, what comes to mind is not the Corvette. But now, I guess GM's hope is, once you begin to think of it, if they keep it for long enough, when you think mid-engine American sports car, you will automatically think Corvette. The new C8 Corvette is largely unopposed, which brings me to the point I'm going to make in the next segment. What does this mean for the future of the Corvette, you may ask? I will unashamedly say, and you Corvette purists out there might disagree, that pure awesomeness lies ahead. I know awesomeness isn't a word, but I just made it up. I can see it now. Corvette's offering a homegrown alternative to the exotic mid-engine cars from abroad. Yes, Italy, I'm talking to you and all of your fancy good-looking cars, You see, with a front-rear layout, front-engined rear drive, that is, performance and handling can only go so far. Weight distribution, handling characteristics, and general driving expertise will never live up to the levels of mid-engine cars. The Corvette, in order to stay competitive, needed to make this jump, and I think it was an opportune time to do so. I know that there will inevitably be some purists out there, like my dear friend Josh, who will say, no, the Corvette is meant to be front-engined. But are they the majority of Corvette fans? I did a bit of research, and to find out the general consensus among longtime Vette aficionados, it seems that the consensus is really split. Let me tell you. It seems that I have gathered that many Corvette fans are skeptical. Some are convinced that American sports cars must be front-engined and that the mid-engine foolishness should be left up to the Europeans. Some, on the other hand, are excited for a new and exciting change to the Corvette. So, from my estimation, the perception or the reception of the new Vette is split, which means GM is actually going to have to work really hard to impress. So, in the pro world, however, the new Vette is the lady of the hour. Excitement has been brewing for her arrival since GM announced it in 2019 sometime. If memory serves correct, I believe it was actually last summer. And just a short story about that. I remember I was in Tokyo, Japan. I was there for 2 months, and I remember getting the notification on my phone, because I am always following and keeping up with car news, that the new C8 Corvette has been announced and it's going to be mid-engine. And I personally am a luxury car type of guy. I'm not a Corvette aficionado. I'm not a Corvette fan per se, but I was super excited to hear that the new Corvette is going to be mid-engine. I mean, it's about time. Decades and decades of rumors swirling around one day that GM is going to make a mid-engine Corvette, blah, 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 this and that. And the rumors have finally come true. They've actually done it. And it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing that America has an affordable mid-engined, dare I say, supercar. I mean, I know we think that the Ford GT is the supercar, which the Ford GT is totally a supercar. The Ford GT has supercar characteristics, supercar technology, supercar production numbers. They barely make any of them. And it also has supercar price tag. I mean, I believe the new Ford GT for 2020 is going to start out at least $400-something thousand, which is infinitely more than the C8 Corvette, even a really well-optioned C8 Corvette. So I think it was about time for the Corvette to come out. But back to what I was saying concerning the pros. I mean, you get people like Car and Driver saying that the Corvette is, the new C8 is more than just the best Corvette. It is amazing. You say Drivers Magazine is saying that it's brilliant. I mean, it seems that the professional world is very, very optimistic for the new Corvette. And YouTubers are just dying to get their hands on it. I mean, Doug DeMuro has been talking about how he hasn't been able to get his hands on one because, the car market and the car people or whatever, the powers at be, essentially, don't really think that YouTubers are true automotive journalists, so they don't give them press cars or things of that sort. And personally, I think that's kind of sad, because if they saw how many views people like Doug DeMuro got and how influential they were in the car world, I mean, they wouldn't poo-poo them in a sense. And even people like me, I've always been passionate about cars, but I learn a lot about the latest news, the latest cars from YouTube. I mean, I don't subscribe to any car magazines. I used to, but then I realized that I can still get the news through YouTube, so I unsubscribed. I mean, YouTube is a great platform. But like I said, I feel like GM has done the logical thing here. Because when you think about it, in the world that we're living in, let's face it, the Corvette, I'm not going to say the Corvette got stale in terms of performance, but since the C4 Corvette, I mean, it got stale in terms of the basic formula. I mean, the C1 Corvette is special. It's a classic. It's collectible. It's highly desirable. The C2 Corvette was romanticized. It was beautiful. There was, the 1963 split window coupe, and that was absolutely gorgeous. It's highly sought after by collectors today. The C3 Corvette, dramatic styling, Coke bottle styling, where it's pinched in the middle and flares at the end. And it was, even though it was absolutely gorgeous, it was choked by emission standards and safety standards and the oil crisis of 1973. And from, the C4 onward, the Corvette had pretty much remained the same. It was a fastback. It had 2 seats. It was front engine, rear wheel drive, always offered with a V8, always offered with a manual. C4, C5, C6, and C7, it's all a blur. It was about time for GM to do something, in your face. And was it a risk? Absolutely. But in order for a car manufacturer to stay viable in today's world, you have to take risks. Some risks are worth taking. And I think transitioning the Corvette from rear drive, front engine to mid-engine rear drive, that is absolutely wonderful, and I think it was the right thing to do. They could have either listened to the very sentimental, kind of whiny folks who are going to be like, well, it's not an American muscle car if it doesn't have front engine and rear wheel drive. First of all, and you'll hear more about this in the next segment that I'm going to do, is the fact that, listen, the Corvette is not really a muscle car. It has American muscle, but it's not really a muscle car. So, it only makes sense. It's the logical progression of the breed. It's the logical progression of the animal. This is how it evolves. It was front engine, rear wheel drive for the longest time. And when that formula was beginning to get stale, they wanted to take it to the next level, push it further, take on the rivals from Europe who have always been mid-engine supercars since probably the Lamborghini Miura came out, which was the first mid-engine supercar. It's great. It's great. It's what needed to be done. It's about time for it to be done. And frankly, I think the only problem is that they didn't do it sooner. But before the break, let me talk about specs. The new C8 Corvette doesn't come with a manual transmission, which is also slightly a slap in the face to the purists. And I would definitely say that it's slightly disappointing that it doesn't come with a manual transmission. But, the thing is, with the dual clutch automatics that are becoming more commonplace in the supercars these days, they are faster, they are more responsive. People who have driven them can attest to that it may not be as fun as a manual transmission where you're doing all the work yourself, but as far as sheer performance and sheer drivability, the dual clutch automatics are better than the manual transmissions. And if you really want manual, it does come with paddle shifters. You can shift it into manual mode and do the shifting yourself. Of course, it doesn't have a clutch pedal, but it's the sign of the times, as Harry Styles would say. It's what's expected. It's what's expected. The manual, the naturally aspirated V8s are becoming a thing of the past. And this is how the car community, especially with supercars that are always receiving the latest and greatest technology. And yes, I'm going to consider the Corvette in that ilk of supercar. This is the logical progression. This is what was going to happen. This is what was meant to happen. And I think GM made the right decision once again. But like I was saying, standard, the Corvette comes with a V8 engine. It does 0 to 60 in 2.8 seconds. That was Car and Driver that timed that. It has a 10-speaker Bose stereo system. It has 8-way power GTI seats, a drive mode selector, and it comes standard with all-season performance tires. The styling is absolutely gorgeous. A nice transition. It still kind of looks like a Corvette, kind of, and I'm using that term loosely, but it looks like a nice evolution of the previous Corvette, which I think is very well received. I don't think anybody's complaining that's ugly. I think they're only complaining about the biggest gripes, the fact that it's mid-engine and the fact that it doesn't have a manual transmission. So in the next segment, I'm going to be discussing the C8's competition, why they should pay more attention to the new kid on the block, and stay tuned for my honest opinion on the C8 and what are my top 5 favorite Corvette-esque automobiles. And by that, I mean cars that are similar to the Corvette. So you'll be hearing about some cars that you didn't even know existed, some other rivals that actually might give a Corvette a run for its money, considering how close they are in price, even though they are still considerably more expensive. But stay tuned. After the break, we are going to be talking about the Corvette's competition. So
are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Okay, welcome back, folks. In the last section, we covered the latest and greatest news on the C8 Corvette before the break and why it is justifiably a huge deal. But now let's talk competitors, or lack thereof, like I've been saying. I know you guys may say, oh, but David, the C8 Corvette has competitors. How about Ferrari and Lamborghini? To which I would say, yes, but think of it this way. Those cars are way out of the C8's price range. When we discuss pricing later, you'll see what I mean. And as the C8 sits currently, it is way more affordable than what Italy and the rest of Europe and even Japan has to offer. This is why I believe the Corvette has largely been a success here in the American market. Think about it. When you think American sports car, I think GM has purposely capitalized on this. You think Corvette. This vehicle has always offered the most bang for your buck, so to speak. As far as the big three go, GM is the only one offering a mid-engine car, or really any sports car at this price point. But what about the Dodge Challenger or the Dodge Charger that can both be equipped with Chrysler's Hellcat motor? And what about Ford's GT and the various high-performance Shelby Mustangs? Here is my response to that. Those are muscle cars, a uniquely American subcategory of performance vehicles. These muscle cars, starting with the Pontiac GTO, largely considered the first muscle car, have been following the same formula for ages now. Large engine up front with loads of power and rear-wheel drive. Not much thought given to handling, but more about sheer power and straight-line speed. The Corvette, in my estimation at least, was never a muscle car. It has American muscle for sure, but it is not a muscle car in the truest sense. And I think GM knows that better than everyone else out there, which is why they have the Camaro and its various trim levels to compete against Chrysler's offerings, the Challenger, and Ford's Mustang. So, if the Corvette is not a muscle car, and it doesn't compete with American muscle cars, then who does it compete with? You see the point now? Nobody really has a viable Corvette competitor here in America, which leads us to do a bit of what I like to call podcast traveling. So buckle your seatbelts, and we are going to be taking a trip around the world of so-called Corvette competitors. Our first stop will be in the Ferrari headquarters in Maranello, Italy. What does Ferrari have for 2020? Of the 6 models, only 2 are mid-engined, and as far as pricing goes, the Ferrari F8 Tributo and F8 Spider, the convertible model, is the closest to the Corvette. The Tributo is, get this, $276,000, and the Spider is slightly cheaper at around $274,000. Now, that's the cheapest mid-engine Ferrari. But just for kicks, let's mention the cheapest new Ferrari. Because let's be real, it's a Ferrari and it will still be comparable in terms of performance. That would be the $215,000 Ferrari Portofino, a 4-seater Grand Tourer. Not exactly a Corvette. A 4-seater Grand Tourer, for those who are not familiar with that term, a Grand Tourer is supposed to be, I guess, the modern version of the personal luxury car in a sense, but instead of being floaty like a personal luxury car of ages past would be, it's meant for performance, but it's meant for comfortable performance, not harsh track-based performance. So think Aston Martin. Aston Martins are Grand Tours. Onward to Sant'Agata Bolognese, Italy, to Lamborghini's headquarters. And I'm sure I probably butchered that name, but I'm not Italian, so it doesn't matter. What does Lamborghini seem to be cooking up? And are they looking to combat the Corvette? Of Lamborghini's three current models, the Aventador, the Huracan, and the Urus, the Huracan is the closest to the new Corvette in price, and it has an MSRP, which stands for Manufacturer's Suggested Retail Price, of $208,571. It is also the cheapest Lamborghini for sale in 2020. Next stop in Ingolstadt, Germany, where Audi's headquarters are located. Audi, despite essentially being Volkswagen's luxury brand, does have a Corvette competitor that I nearly forgot about, which how can I forget about the Audi R8? It's absolutely wonderful. It's actually one of my favorite supercars. But for the 2020 year, it has an MSRP of $169,000. Now that's slightly cheaper. And now if you start, messing around with the Corvette and optioning it, I mean, you're going to get into the $100,000 territory. So for a well-optioned C8 Corvette, you're looking, it's not super close, but it's barking up Audi's tree a little bit. So, I mean, that might be something that Corvette or Audi, for that matter, has to watch out for. And before we leave Europe, we're going to take a trip into Bavaria, where in Munich, BMW's headquarters are located. There we find the quirky BMW i8, which is still in production. And with its three-cylinder engine mated to a hybrid drivetrain, it is hard to believe that this BMW is a real Corvette competitor. The i8 has a starting price of $147,500. Now, the reason why I say it's hard to believe that this is a Corvette competitor, because on paper, it sounds like an economy car. It has a three-cylinder engine that is mated to a hybrid drivetrain, and it's expensive. It sounds like an economy car, but the fact that it's expensive kind of throws you off. But you have to see the i8. The i8 is mid-engined. It is a genuine sports car, and it has nearly 400 horsepower. And when you think of it, the new C8 Corvette doesn't have that much more performance to offer when it comes to comparing it against BMW's i8. So when we think of it that way, BMW's i8 is a legitimate competitor to the Corvette in a sense. And in another sense, it's in a class of its own because it's futuristic. It doesn't have the tried and true V8 engine that supercars are so used to having, especially here in America, or sports cars for that matter. And on this podcast trip, our last stop will be in Japan to Honda's headquarters in Minato City, Tokyo, Japan. Why Honda, you ask? Don't they just make boring hybrids? Well, yes, they do, but Honda actually has the NSX, my literal favorite Honda of all time. Now, for a little bit of NSX history, if time allows, I will say that the Honda NSX was introduced in 1992 as, I guess a economic alternative to a supercar. I mean, that sounds like an oxymoron in itself, the fact that a supercar can be economic, but leave it up to the Japanese to find out how to make a supercar that is also efficient, because this is what I absolutely love about the Honda NSX. It is surprisingly normal. I mean, it is, it's amazing. The first NSXs offered a six-cylinder engine that was mid-engine, but they shared parts with Honda's Accord, Honda's Civic. I mean, the interior was nice. It was well appointed, but I mean, it wasn't crazy. It's not like parts for these cars were bespoke to the car itself. I mean, they just came from Honda's parts bin. And the fact that Honda was able to do that also keeps the Honda NSX affordable, or as we call it here in America, the Acura NSX. The NSX is $157,500 starting out. So, after I've mentioned all of these prices, how much is the C8 Corvette? Get this, folks. You might want to sit down for this. It starts out for a base model, a base coupe, at $58,900. That is genuinely incredible. This is great news for GM. I mean, they seem to have this market segment wrapped around their fingers. The new C8 is what the Fiero hoped to be. Rest in peace, Pontiac. I loved Pontiac when it was alive. And, I mean, part of me still has some hope that they're going to bring back Pontiac. And part of me even is crazy enough to want to, try to think of what would it be like to have a Pontiac version of the C8 Corvette. I know it's never going to happen, but I mean, that's just my fantasy anyway. So this is what the Pontiac Fiero hoped to be. If you remember correctly, the Fiero was a mid-engine sports car that was meant for the masses, that was meant to be affordable. And the C8 Corvette, 33 years later, just about, is doing what its spiritual successor, if you will, couldn't do. An affordable mid-engined American sports car is something that hasn't really been seen since then. The C8 has no other mid-engine competitors in the market at this price point, and though there are some offerings from Porsche and Nissan with the GTR that are somewhat comparable in price, and I mean still considerably more expensive, they don't have the cachet of being mid-engine cars. Granted, the Corvette hasn't had a real consistent competitor in really its history. I mean, let's just take a moment to explain why I didn't mention some of the Porsches. I didn't mention the GTR that's made by Nissan. I didn't mention some of the other cars like the Bentleys and other things of that sort, because those cars are in a separate league. The Corvette of the previous generation may have considered to be competitors against those cars. But that was front-engined rear-wheel drive. I mean, if you look at the supercar world, there is a stark divide. There is front-engined rear-wheel drive cars, and there are mid-engined rear-wheel drive cars, and there are mid-engine all-wheel drive cars, and those are the super, hypercars, like the Bugatti Chiron, the Bugatti Veyron, the Paganis, those other cars. But I mean, as talking about the sports cars, which obviously sports cars are expensive, but ones that you typically think of in the $100,000 to $200,000 range, I mean, even those cars that have front engines, they may be considered in that range. In that price point, and maybe even considered competitors on paper. I don't consider them competitors for the simple fact that they are not mid-engined cars. I mean, the Corvette has made a fundamental leap where it leaves all of those behind. And you will see that once more numbers begin to come out about how well the Corvette competes. Ford came out with the beloved Thunderbird in 1955 to compete against the Corvette, but after the first generation of the Thunderbird moved to a more luxurious segment and left the Corvette alone, it wasn't until the early 90s that there was another Corvette competitor from an American brand. Chrysler came out with the Viper that ran from 92 to 2017, which was a respectable 25 years. However, the Viper was a much more serious car than the Corvette, being almost completely analog and instilling fear even into the most experienced drivers. I once heard a statistic, and don't quote me on this, but I heard that 20% of Viper owners who bought their cars new crashed them on the way home. That was 1 in 5 of every person who bought a Viper crashed on the way home. No power brakes. No ABS, no traction control. I mean, I think it had power steering, but it was super analog, and that was not a real competitor to the Corvette. I mean, the Viper was in a class of its own. I mean, it was old-fashioned. It was brute power, V10 engine, front rear-wheel drive, analog almost completely. I mean, even though it, was reminiscent of the Corvette in the way it looked and in the way it was positioned in the market, it sold a lot less, and it was a lot more serious than the Corvette ever could have hoped to be as far as driving goes. So this explains why the Corvette has sold so well in its 67-year history. I mean, the Corvette is pure Americana. GM has been brilliant at exploiting this market. On top of that, Corvettes are usable and have a reputation for being reliable. So, after the break, we will discuss the almost 70-year history of the Corvette, from the fragile and anemic C1 to the choked C3 and the mysterious gap year in 1983 to the present C8 that is absolutely wonderful. And be sure to stay tuned for the last segment in which I discuss my opinion of the C8 and which are my favorite Corvette-esque automobiles.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, welcome back, folks. Before the break, we talked about the Vette's long-held unique position in the car market and its so-called competitors. But where did the story of America's sports car begin? Let's go back to 1953 with the original Corvette, the C1. This Corvette was a fragile one, having been made of fiberglass and having an anemic blue flame inline six-cylinder. This Corvette was a humble yet beloved introduction of the American sports car. This Corvette had its sights set on the nimble, lightweight sports cars from Europe. Because, let's be honest, American cars weren't known for being exactly nimble or lightweight at the time. I mean, remember, this was the 50s. Fins were becoming a thing. Lots of chrome, lots of pomp and circumstance and styling, and not much thought given to performance, or if performance was considered, not handling. So lightweight and nimble was definitely not the adjectives you wanted to use for cars of that time period that came from America. This Corvette underwent a number of facelifts. In 1956, the design was updated, and in 58, it was refreshed thoroughly with a new and larger front fascia with quad headlamps and a redesigned interior. In 1962, production of the C1 ended. This generation Corvette cemented the idea of the American sports car. Not to say that there hadn't been American sports cars in the past. I tend to think of the Auburn Boat-tail Speedster of the 20s and the 30s, but this began a heritage that was largely regarded as the American sports car, beloved by many around the world. So yes, the Corvette really did usher in, it ushered in an era of where America had a sports car to call its own. I mean, before the Corvette was thought of, I would like to, pay my respects to the Auburn Boat-tail Speedster. I mean, there are probably other sports cars before this. I mean, there was the Duesenberg Model J, but that was more of a... Oh, goodness, that was more of a grand tourer. But, I mean, as far as a sports car went, the Auburn Boat-tail Speedster was really an American sports car. And it's so sad that Auburn was short-lived. Auburn didn't last very long. I believe by the mid-1930s, it was already out of business. It had already gone bankrupt. But, yeah, the Auburn Boat-tail Speedster, I would say the Corvette. Forgive me if anybody doesn't believe this or if you all don't even know about the Auburn Boat-tail Speedster. But I believe that the Corvette was like a spiritual successor to it. Small, lightweight, front engine, rear wheel drive with power and speed to boot. So the C2, moving on, was introduced in 1963 with the lovely split window coupe. This style of rear window was only offered for the 1963 model year. After that, it was changed to a full rear window from 1964 to 1967, and that was obviously because of visibility issues. When people were backing up, I mean, if you have a pillar right in between your rear windshield, you can't really see. But nonetheless, it was a very romantic design, if you will. It was absolutely wonderful, and people are, still searching after them today. I actually saw one at a car show that I covered in a news story not too terribly long ago, probably last year around this time, and it was amazing to see a 1963 split window C2 Corvette in the flesh, or in the metal, if you will. But yeah, it was a great, I guess, car to cement the history of the Corvette, to cement the Corvette in the psyche of the American car lover. Because the C1 Corvette, they were romanticized, they were loved, they were pretty, but they weren't very good as far as performance goes, at least from 1953 to 1955. In 56, they got a V8 engine, and in 62, they finally put them out of production and then built the C2. Some other things about this generation, it was the first to have pop-up headlights, a feature that would continue until the end of the C5 Corvette in 2004. This Corvette would be the last performer for a while, because we who are privy to car history all know what happened in the next decade. That's right, the fuel crisis of 1973. So, let me preface this by saying, I don't hate the C3 Corvette, but I will say that the C3 Corvette was probably not the best generation of the Corvette, even though it ran for 14 years. Frankly, I think it was 14 years too long, but I will explain to you why the C3 Corvette had its fair share of challenges, if you will. The C3 Corvette was produced from 68 to 82. This production run of 14 years was the longest of the generations of Corvettes. This generation saw changes such as a more dramatic Coke bottle styling and the addition of 5-mile-per-hour bumpers for safety regulations. Now, I mentioned that this generation was choked. What do I mean by that? Now, we're going to get a little bit into history here. And of course, this is the history segment of the podcast. But I mean, we're going to delve a little deeper into history as far as what big changes were going on in the car world at the time. So in order for us to understand this, we must first consider two things. During this generation of the Vette, the standard for horsepower ratings changed from measuring the gross horsepower that an engine produced to the net power that an engine produced. Basically, gross horsepower is how much power the engine produces under ideal testing conditions when it is not attached to the car. Net horsepower is the real-life output of the engine when it is installed in the vehicle. Net horsepower is ultimately always lower than gross horsepower because engines never operate at ideal testing conditions in the real world. This was the first hit to the C3's power ratings, though this made it more realistic. So essentially, all of that just to say that gross power was the old way of measuring horsepower, net power was the new way. So they basically, when they designed the engine, they put it on a stand, they animated it, and then they did the horsepower ratings from there. But that was not considering the weight of the car. That was not considering the load that the engine would have to bear. That was not considering realistic driving conditions, how much horsepower would actually be produced after all of these things were attached to the engine. And air conditioning, of course, air conditioning sucks power from the engine, even in engines nowadays. So I mean, like, you know, that was really the first hit to the C3's power ratings, if you will, which this one was a more perceived thing. It wasn't actually real because those engines, if they were, let's say, 250 horsepower with the old system and the new system was 220 horsepower, if they had been using the new system all along, all of those massive numbers that we saw would have been lower anyway. So this was more perceived. But people who are privy to this, like me before I did this research, I was like, oh my gosh, like these Corvettes were barely making any power. So that's the reason why, at least it's one of the reasons why. And then we get into the oil crisis. This was the first hit to the, anyway. So the oil crisis was basically when all Americans all-American cars were being faced with stricter environmental regulations. The gas prices had begun to go up. Cars needed to become more efficient. And this was a hit not only to the Corvette, but to all other American cars. The Corvette transitioned in this time from being a sporty and muscly to being more of a grand tourer. It became more focused on comfort, on luxury, and safety. So the power outreach reached an all-time low of 180 horsepower for the base engine in 1976 to 1977. Now, let's just compare that to the C2 Corvette. This is compared to the base engine of the previous generation that produced, let's see here, 250 horsepower. The Corvette wouldn't start performing again until the near end of the C3 production run in 1980 to 1982. By the time the late 70s, 80s came along, the oil crisis was still a recent memory, but it had been a little bit, it had been a bit more time for GM to actually figure out what they were going to do in order to combat these regulations, in order to make the Corvette be able to still perform while meeting the regulations and while taking into account the more efficient they had to be because gas prices were going so high because there was a shortage of oil. So you may ask, why did I end it in 1982? What happened in 1983? Well, I had to do a bit of research because before this, I didn't know, but according to History.com, Corvette production didn't have a gap year in 1983, but rather a leap year in 1983. And it was very purposeful why they said that. It was because the new C4, originally intended for production in 1982, was delayed because of the vast advancements in technology that were being brought to the C4. You see, the C3 Vet was basically a new body shell built on a glorified version of the C2 platform that had been around since 1963. Now, this is actually pretty common for car companies to do. They have a generation, and the new generation is not much more than just the new body on the old platform. I mean, you can think of some of your more regular cars. I mean, there seems to be a new generation of the Camry every 3 or 4 years. This is not actually the case. It's just a new body, maybe a refreshed interior slapped on, a platform that they've been using for ages. I mean, think of the Ford Crown Victoria and the Panther platform that had been around since like the 70s. I mean, they had done it until the 2011 model year, and those cars were just new bodies on top of old platforms. So it was time for a bottom-up redesign, essentially, and that's exactly what Chevrolet did. The reason why it was delayed until 1984 was the fact that it was originally designed to be a T-top, but this idea was exchanged for one-piece removable top, like those more common on European sports cars. This took engineers nearly a year to figure out, which pushed production back to 1984. However, there's one singular 1983 Corvette that exists. It is currently in the Corvette Museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky, which has long been where the Corvette has been built. The C4 was truly the generation that ushered the Corvette into the modern era. After this leap year, as History.com likes to call it, this Corvette was aimed squarely at the European rivals from Porsche. From Porsche, Lamborghini, and Ferrari. This generation once again performed and did so well, with several special editions and performance packages that are still seen on modern Corvettes today. Things like the ZR1, the ZL, however Z's and different combinations of numbers that they have. These were really started in the 1980s with the C4 Corvette. This generation also seemed to be the first look like Corvettes today. And what I mean by that, it's what introduced what we think of the classic Corvette look. I mean, you think of Corvettes from today, they look absolutely nothing like the C1 Corvette, absolutely nothing like the C2 Corvette, and the C3 Corvette was very dramatically styled, and cars aren't really dramatically styled that much anymore. But when you think of the Corvettes that are in most recent memory, that basic formula for the design started in the 1980s with the C4 Corvette. From the C4 to the C7, it seems that each Corvette didn't stray too far from this design. They all seem to elegantly evolve from each other, and this design was the basis for them all. Fun fact, by the way, the generation that we call the C4, the fourth generation, included the LT1 engine. That was put into this Corvette. And this engine was actually put in, albeit in a detuned version, into the GM B-body cars and the D-body cars that Cadillac had of the era. These cars included the Cadillac Fleetwood, the Buick Roadmaster, the Chevy Caprice, and the Chevy Impala SS, as well as even the Buick Estate Wagon. So think of that. You can get a performance chip to boost this engine's power outrating to 300 horsepower like it had in the Corvette, to have a 300 horsepower Cadillac Fleetwood, a 300 horsepower Buick Roadmaster, 300 horsepower Chevy Caprice, or Buick Roadmaster Estate Wagon, which I think is the coolest thing ever. If I were to own one of those cars, I would totally do that. And if you have one of those cars out there, you might want to take a look at doing that too, if you don't mind spending a bit of money. The C5 Corvette was produced from 1997, the year of my birth, until 2004. The C5 was the last generation to feature pop-up headlights and improved upon the C4 in terms of build quality and engineering, but it wasn't vastly different. Styling was more rounded, but nothing too crazy was done. C6 was produced from 2005 till 2013. The C6 had exposed headlights and offered a high-performance ZR1 just like the generations before. During this generation of the Corvette, there was a short-lived Cadillac version called the Xlr. This car was built on the same Y platform as the Corvette and was meant to be a grand touring option. It included the 4.6-liter Northstar engine and was produced from 2004 to 2009. The C7 Corvette was the last of the traditional Corvettes. This generation was produced from 2014 to 2019, and this would be the front-engined rear-wheel drive Corvette's swan song, in a sense. Overall, the Corvette had a long and storied past. The beloved C1s to the romanticized C2, the dramatically styled C3, to the revolutionary C4, and the blur of the C5 to the C7. The C8 is here to cement the persona of the Corvette into the American car lover's mind. And I mean, so far, it's only been around for a year just about, and it's making leaps and bounds as far as that mission goes. So please stay tuned for the next segment, in which I talk about my favorite Corvette-esque cars, and I tell you my honest opinion of the C8 Corvette.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Okay, welcome back, folks. Finally, the moment we've all been waiting for. What do I have to say about the C8 Corvette? It's not a secret that I love it. I remember, like I said earlier in the podcast, when I first heard about the C8 Corvette, I had known that there was eventually going to be a new model of the Corvette coming. I mean, this past generation, the C7, was produced from 2014 to 2017 or something. And I remember when it came out, I remember the first time I saw one. I was coming back from Miami with my family, and we were actually stuck, broken down at a rest stop, but that's another story in its own time. And we saw these three older gentlemen with their Corvettes that they had just bought. There was a yellow one, there was a red one, and there was a green one, and I believe there was a blue one, so there might have been 4 people there. And they had just parked, and I guess they were just showing off their Corvettes at this Miccosukee Indian Reservation Service Plaza in the middle of Alligator Alley in Florida, and it was crazy. But I remember seeing the C7 Corvette, and now the C8 Corvette is out, and I think it's the logical progression, honestly. I mean, when you really think of it, like I said, the people who are griping, moaning, and complaining about the C7 Corvette being the last real Corvette and saying that, oh, you know, all Corvettes have to be front engine, rear wheel drive, those people don't understand how car makers operate. They don't understand how the car market works, in a sense. I mean, think of it. You've been seeing basically the same, you know, formula for Corvettes for the entire history. Now that the Camaro has basically become what the Corvette used to be, the front-engined, rear-wheel drive monster that the Corvette used to be when the Camaro was still anemic, when the Camaro was still, you know, struggling to make power. I mean, it was crazy. It was absolutely crazy to see a C8 Corvette being a mid-engine car, but it makes sense. It makes sense. It is romantic. It is beautiful. It is alluring. It is absolutely amazing. And I absolutely love it. I mean, I keep on saying I love it, but I really do. I will talk about how affordable it is. My friend Hiroki and I were talking about this when I had first realized that the C8 Corvette was coming out in Japan. Not in Japan. Not coming out in Japan. I was in Japan when it was coming out. And we were talking about how this was going to be offered for less than $60,000 US. I mean, what other mid-engine American car exists that is that cheap? The only other mid-engine American car that exists is the Ferrari, not the Ferrari, that's Italian, the Ford GT, which is like $500,000 or something ridiculous like that. And Ford doesn't sell it to just anybody. You have to be chosen for them to sell it to you, and you have to sign an agreement that you're not going to just flip it. Yeah, you have to sign an agreement that you're not going to modify it in any way. You have to sign all sorts of foolishness. And I mean, like, the Corvette is there, it's easy, it's accessible, and it's affordable. And I absolutely love it. I mean, like I said, I'm a luxury car type of guy. I love Cadillacs. I currently drive a Buick. I like my traditional American luxury cars. But if I were in the market, if I were rich and I wanted a Corvette, I would definitely buy a C8. I mean, the C7, the C6, the C5, the C4, the C3. I mean, those same basic formula. Front, it got boring after a while. I mean, the Corvette had to keep people on its toes. It had to be new. It had to be exciting. It had to be sexy, if I may use that word. I mean, in order for it to survive, especially with the Camaro being basically an internal competitor now, I mean, it had to make the leap. It had to make the transition into becoming a mid-engine car. Let's talk about the other car companies in America, though. Ford. What's Ford going to do? Is Ford going to let GM take over this market segment? Affordable sports cars. Affordable mid-engine sports cars. Because let me tell you, you can make so many different Mustangs, so many different Shelbys, so many different GT350s, GT500s, GT this, GT that. I mean, you can do all you want. You can make a Mach 1. You could bring... It's not mid-engined. And I know I'm making a big deal about that, but it's true, though. It's not mid-engine. I mean, those cars are inherently hindered in what they can do because they are using an old formula. Using a mid-engine formula, you know, the C8 Corvette is going to outperform even the most expensive Mustang because it's more equally, you know, the weight is more equally distributed. It is it's more supercar-esque, if I could put it that way. I mean, Mustangs are not supercars. GT350s made by Shelby, which are versions of the Mustangs, are not supercars. GT500s aren't supercars. I mean, those are not supercars. They are muscle cars. Some people might call them sports cars. They are great. They are wonderful, but they are not Corvette competitors. And Chrysler, what is Chrysler doing? What has Chrysler been thinking? They discontinued the Viper. I mean, if sales are falling, then don't discontinue the car. Come out with something new and crazy to allure people to buy it again. But I guess Chrysler was super set on having the Dodge Viper be analog, having the Dodge Viper be a car that had a V10 cast iron block engine that was old-fashioned in a sense, but, struggling or not struggling, soldiering on into the modern era, but they discontinued it. I mean, you hear whispers that maybe Chrysler one day is going to come out with a mid-engine Hellcat-powered Dodge Viper to compete against the C8 Corvette, but we have yet to hear anything from Chrysler concerning that, and we have yet to see anything. I know I'm just a lowly podcaster over here, but I mean, if I were to have a word of advice for Ford and for Chrysler, I mean, don't let GM dominate this market for too long. Come out with something. Granted, it's not going to have the same heritage as the C8 Corvette does with the Corvette's long and storied past. Granted, it's not going to be as, not going to be as popular, maybe, unless it's really good. But Ford, do something. Chrysler, do something. I mean, Ford tried to come back with the Thunderbird, which was originally Corvette's first main competitor back in the 1950s, which I'll discuss when I discuss my favorite Corvette esque cars in a little bit. But I mean, Ford came out with the Thunderbird. They produced it until 1997, came back with it in like 2002, and then discontinued it in 2005 because the new Thunderbird was a flop. I mean, it was a two-seater. It was front engine, rear wheel drive, but it was floaty like a Lincoln Town Car. I mean, it was built on the Lincoln LS platform, shared the platform with the Jaguar S. I mean, Ford didn't do the Thunderbird justice. If Ford is going to revive the nameplate, make it mid-engined and affordable to combat the Corvette. I mean, that's what the Thunderbird was originally meant for, so why not go back to its original heritage? Chrysler, come back with the Dodge Viper. I mean, if we're really hearing whispers about a Hellcat-powered Viper that was going to be mid-engined to go against the Corvette, do it. I mean, let's see some action. Let's see some tussling in the car world with, competition. I mean, I love the Corvette. I'm a GM guy. I'm rooting for it, but I would like to see some competition. So that's basically what my thoughts on the C8 Corvette are. And now I'm going to discuss my top 5 favorite Corvette-esque cars from the past and the present. Basically, my number 5 is the Audi R8. This is in descending order. The Audi R8, I'm not super into German cars, but I like it. Something with Germany making well-built cars that are heavy, that are, German engineered is enticing when it comes to a sports car, when it comes to a mid-engine sports car. That is a Corvette competitor that I can see, people might be going for instead of the C8 Corvette. The Callaway C5. The Callaway C5 is a Corvette that was modified by the Callaway car company, and that is something that I saw in a video game ages ago that I absolutely fell in love with. It was based off of a C5 Corvette, hence the name, and it was modified, boosted power, and other things of that sort. So that was wonderful. It was a limited production kind of coach-built version of the C5 Corvette, and I thought it was super cool. I mean, they're exceedingly rare. I've never seen one in person. I've only heard of them. I think I saw a Callaway Corvette, not a C5 from this generation, at a car museum, but don't quote me on that. I could be wrong. And my number 3 is the Callaway Corvette Aero Wagon. This was based off of the C7 Corvette, and it was hilarious. I mean, not hilarious in a bad sense, like a laughable sense, but it was hilarious that they decided to do this. I mean, it was cool. It was like a shooting brake, as the Europeans call it, which is basically a sports car wagon, like a supercar wagon in a sense, with a opening hatch in the back over where the traditional cargo area would be in the C7 Corvette. It looked decent. And it kind of reminded me of the BMW Z3, which they affectionately call the clown shoe, or the Ferrari FF. I mean, that's what it reminded me of. And I think that is a super cool car. Like I said, they're exceedingly rare. I don't think they made many of them. I've never seen one in person, but if I could get my hands on one, I totally would buy it. And the Cadillac Xlr. I mean, this was Cadillac's response, in a sense, to the Corvette. Not really so much a response, in a sense, like they were competing, but a response like, look, if you want Corvette levels of performance, but with Cadillac comfort and a Cadillac image and Cadillac design, here's the Xlr. Granted, it didn't sell very well, but I believe that these will be very collectible cars in the future. And that's the reason why I put it on this list. Not because it was super popular, not because it was super good in a sense, but because that Cadillac went out on a limb and made a Cadillac Corvette. I mean, when you look at years and years and years of Cadillac history, it's now that the Cadillac has begun to even offer any sort of performance vehicles. The CTS-V was one, the Cadillac Xlr was another, and of course now you have several V-Series cars in the Cadillac lineup. But I mean, this was genuinely amazing, and I absolutely loved it. It was great. The Cadillac Xlr was a grand touring option, and it was meant to offer a refined Corvette for people of refined taste. I would have to mention the first generation Thunderbird. Obviously, I mean, the Ford Thunderbird is probably one of my favorite cars. And even though it's not a Corvette-esque automobile in today's sense, competing against a Corvette, but back then, I mean, the Ford Thunderbird against the C1 Corvette, it wasn't even a competition. They outsold Corvettes 23-1. They were steel, body-on-frame construction, V8, whereas the Corvettes were fiberglass. They had an inline six-cylinder for the first 3 years, and they were fragile and anemic and not very well designed or very well executed for the first iterations of the Corvettes. So Ford Thunderbird, I mean, outsold Corvettes like hotcakes. I mean, it wasn't even a competition. So as far as a classic, a Corvette-esque automobile, I mean, this was definitely my favorite, the first generation Thunderbird. Of course, in 58, they switched to what they called the Squarebirds, and that was basically the end of the Thunderbird versus Corvette rivalry. So basically what we talked about in this podcast was the C8 Corvette. What's new? What's exciting? What is so great about it? And we talked about the competitors or lack thereof at this price point. I mean, we look at a car that's mid-engine, that has a top speed of almost 200 miles per hour, like 196 miles per hour. It has Ferrari levels of performance, Ferrari-esque styling for a fraction of the price, a fraction of even the Japanese competitor, the Acura NSX. I mean, you know, Corvette is really, you know, making leaps and bounds as far as what goes on in the car world, what goes on in the car community. I will say that, you know, the other car companies, you know, they need to step up their game. We also talked about Corvette history, and we also talked about my personal take on the Corvette, in which you're still hearing me ramble about that. But thank you very much for listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you all to please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. And also, if you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, thank you and have a good night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.